Welcome to the next episode of Supporting Leaders. You guys, I'm so excited to have with us today Jenni Donohoo. And I'm going to get into a little bit of the personal connection here, but let me just read the bio. This is like Jenni, I'm a little bit like starstruck to have you on this afternoon, but Jenni is a 4-time best-selling author and professional learning facilitator. She has more than 20 years of experience in leading school change. She works in school divisions across North America, supporting high-quality professional learning designed to improve outcomes for all students. As the director of the Jenni Donohoo Center for Collective Efficacy, Jenni has been recognized internationally as an educational thought leader. She has a PhD in educational studies and supervisory office qualifications. She's taught elementary, secondary, and post-secondary schools and is the former president of Learning Forward Ontario. And so, Jenni, your book, which I have a copy of right here, Collective Efficacy, this is just one of several that you've written. But this book, when I was a principal at the middle school, we did a book study on it. And for those who are in education, you probably know about John Hattie's research. For those outside of education, he wrote Visible Learning, which was a synthesis of over 800 meta-analysis, I think, relating to student achievement. And Jenni, was it number one on his list was Collective Efficacy?
That is correct.
Yeah, number one. And I think so the effect size was 1.57. So I'm going to jump in and ask you then, first question, okay, describe to us what is collective efficacy?
Collective efficacy, first and foremost, is a belief. It's the shared conviction that teachers in a school make an educational difference to students over and above the educational impact of students' homes and communities. And I should attribute that definition to Megan Shannon Moran, who's one of the leading researchers on the topic. Another thing to note about efficacy beliefs is that they're future-oriented beliefs about what we're capable of accomplishing given a specific situation. And what we know is when efficacy beliefs are firmly established, it leads to higher student achievement. And that's because teachers tend to put forth greater effort and persist even when faced with obstacles. When efficacy is diminished, people don't put forth the effort because they feel their efforts aren't going to amount to much. So they tend to give up more easily.
Yes. So in your work on collective efficacy, have you ever done any work in outside of school settings?
Well, it actually has its roots in criminology research. And in the 1960s, researchers were looking at the impact of collective neighborhood efficacy and the relationship between neighborhood efficacy and lower crime rates. And so that those studies dating back, like I said, into the 60s showed that the more efficacious neighbors felt in their ability to positively decrease crime rates, then there was less crime in those areas. The studies I've read recently that's one of the most robust findings in criminology research. And there's also research that shows in sports and in business, the more efficacious a team feels, the better they perform. So of course, collective teacher efficacy in schools is significant as well. But collective efficacy is kind of like a universal, I guess, concept that comes to fruition in many ways, in many domains.
Wow, I'm really so you facilitate a lot with schools, with school leaders. What's the most important thing for leaders to consider when wanting to implement or create or inspire an environment of collective efficacy?
That's a great question. And what we know through the research around what are the antecedents of collective efficacy, what are the things in the environment that, if in place, are likely to enhance teachers' sense of efficacy. One of the big ones is when teachers feel a sense of empowerment. And so how can leaders ensure that teachers feel in an authentic way that they have some decision-making power and autonomy in matters related to school improvement? That's probably one of the bigger ones. There is a clear and strong relationship between the degree of teacher leadership in a school and collective efficacy. What's interesting is you don't know the direction. Some of the studies assume that teacher leadership is the precursor and collective efficacy is the outcome, and some studies assume it the other way around. But I think that that's probably one of the first steps, is finding ways to engage teachers so that they feel ownership and, as I said earlier, autonomy within, within the professional boundaries, of course.
Yes, and I was just kind of looking at your website too, and you had written an article, I believe, with Peter DeWitt a couple years ago, and it was about shared decision making. What are some ways that you've seen leaders create that?
And this is definitely a process. And, it's funny that you just are reminding me, I was working with a school just this past week, and the principal has a leadership team that is reading my book, and they're doing a book study. And he's really wanting teachers to feel empowered. So he's got his leadership team, and he wanted me to come on, and he was saying, maybe you can tell us what to do next. And then he stopped and he paused and he said, wait a minute, Nola. He said, I'm thinking wrong. He said, maybe we can work with the leadership team and we can figure out with them, we could ask them what they think the next steps are, and they can, make those decisions. So just ensuring that, even though ultimately the buck stops with the formal leaders, looking for ways to ensure that teachers are included in decisions that matter, and accessing their voice, asking their opinions, making sure that they understand that they're heard, and just being part of decisions where possible.
Yeah, what would you say to the leader who's like, okay, Jenni, that sounds great, but like that's going to slow me down. That's going to slow the organization down so much to do that. What would you say to that?
Yeah, even though it might take longer, it's going to be the better route in the long term. It does take time, and collective efficacy can't be built overnight. But besides engaging teachers in decision making, I think another important aspect that leaders can do, again, that takes some time, is helping teachers to set some common goals. And so that goal consensus is another empowering or enabling condition that helps to build a sense of efficacy as well. And then what's important, as teachers see that they're making progress toward those goals, they start to build a sense of efficacy. Efficacy beliefs, it's, you can't instill a sense of efficacy by setting up the conditions for success when it's easy.
Yeah.
And let me back up and say that efficacy beliefs are formed when a team accomplishes something that they don't think they're capable of doing. So when we talk about those goals, when teachers accomplish it, as a result, they feel a sense of efficacy.
Another thing that you just referenced too was building consensus. So, let's say that you're working towards building consensus and you recognize that we're not even close to having consensus. So, I mean, what's your next step? Because how do you create consensus if it's not there?
Yeah, so definitely a process. I find a lot of protocols are helpful, and I utilize protocols to engage people in a consensus building activity. But one piece that I find is really important is when we're building, or when we're working toward building consensus on those goals. It's not about the things that we've learned about at the last conference or the last virtual event perhaps that we attended, and that idea that we're always reaching for the shiny thing in the sandbox.
Yeah.
When the goals are built around student learning needs, that's where I think we get more consensus, when we ensure that we're looking to both the asset-based approach, what are some of the strengths that students bring that we can build upon, but what are some of the urgent needs that we all have, that our students have in common. And once we start talking about the student learning need, then we start to buy in and gain consensus on goals. So whether it be that students, I'm thinking of a COVID-19 environment, especially if teachers are teaching and students are learning remotely, one of the needs that we could identify that would gain us consensus on and determining the goals that we want would be perhaps all of our students, or most of our students, need a sense of belonging in an online environment, or our students need to be able to engage and work independently more so in an online environment. So
Yeah.
that becomes the goal, the
Yeah.
shared goal.
Yeah. So in difficult times like, this in a pandemic and when things have maybe shifted in a school environment or school culture, does that make it easier to establish collective efficacy?
That's a great question. So I want to just go to the work of Bandura for a moment. Bandura, Albert Bandura, educational psychologist out of Stanford University, he was the one who coined the term and studied it, collective and individual efficacy. And his work shows that there are four sources that inform an individual's and a team's beliefs about what they're capable of accomplishing. One of those sources is emotions and feelings, and we could have very positive emotions, satisfaction, excitement, and those become efficacy enhancing. Or we can have negative emotions like stress, anxiety, fear,
Yeah.
and those become efficacy diminishing. So in the time of a pandemic, what the research shows is there's elevated negative affective states. Those feelings tend to be, brought more to the surface. And so, yes, I think that they could put collective efficacy at risk. But at the same time, what I've experienced is that teachers are collaborating more so now than ever before. And I think that COVID-19 has, helped to legitimize an environment where help seeking is,
Yes.
legitimized, where people feel it's okay to reach out for support.
I want to switch gears a little bit with you and ask you, in all of your work with collective efficacy and working with schools, is there like one cool story that you have that you could share of how you've seen the work really pay off in a situation or an environment?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's what I can describe it as is, and I just love the term flow,
Yeah.
and collective flow. And the concept of flow is when you're so immersed in something that all of your time and energy just, is focused on that thing. Well, I've experienced with some teams that collective flow where they've set a goal, they've worked hard as a team to implement strategies that they've selected that are promising approaches to reaching that goal. And then when they see the results, they see that the students have progressed or that it made a difference for the kids. And that moment where they realize their collective efforts resulted in improvements for the students, and that excitement, kind of happens. I was going to give you a specific example of a school, a team that was working toward improving. In the end, it was around, ultimately, they were looking to improve standardized test scores, but they were working with students and giving them feedback and, making a difference in their everyday, school experiences as well. But when they did receive the annual test scores and saw that the students had significantly improved, that was a definite way that they felt that their efficacy had increased as well, which then they set higher goals the next time around, right? It's this, reciprocal relationship where the improvement in student achievement increases efficacy,
Yeah.
that, in turn, people work harder because they see. It's that idea of interpreting our success through a growth mindset that really
Yes.
helps
Yes.
make that
So
link
in that scenario
upwards.
too, you referenced a school and then you had talked about too, like a team. And so it made me wonder, if you're thinking organization, the whole organization, is it easier sometimes to get a small subset or a small team within that organization rolling with collective efficacy to really get that to snowball?
I just read a study that looked at that exact question that you just asked. And in this study, they say that it was easier to establish efficacy amongst the teams first before trying to instill it within the entire organization. And as more teams felt a sense of efficacy, then it started to build through the entire faculty. Makes sense, I think that with this, the optimal team size, probably between 5 and 7 teachers that share students and common goals, and then eventually spreading that out throughout the school. But I think the team is the unit that is really an important concept for us to consider.
Yeah. What are some other things that you're working on? I mean, are you in the middle of a book? Are you in the middle of getting a book out? Are you researching some other things? What are some projects that you're involved in right now?
I love to continue to write, and I just had an article published in Educational Leadership, the most recent edition, co-written with my friend Anne, and people can maybe go and see that in ASCD's Educational Leadership. It's called Beyond Collaboration, the Power of Joint Work, and we talk about efficacy and how that works in a team setting. I just also, in November, I'm not sure if you're aware, but my co-author and friend Stephanie Height and I wrote Leading Collective Efficacy, and the subtitle is Powerful Stories of Achievement and Equity. And in it, we outline the enabling conditions, and in each chapter, we share a real case study of a leader or a team or people in a school that have done two things: saw increases in student achievement and been able to decrease gaps between students. And so that's the latest. Right now, I'm not writing anything, but probably will look to do so down the road.
So Jenni, I always end with this question. I love to see how people answer this differently. But when you think about leadership, and feel free to think leadership in general or just leadership when it comes to what you've seen with collective efficacy, what's one thing that you know for sure?
That's a great question. I think what I know for sure is that leaders can make or break the work. Leaders are in such an important position that when you have somebody who's a really bad leader, I've seen the consequences of that, what bad leadership does for people, and it's emotionally draining, and it doesn't do anything for our students. When the adults in the building are dealing with poor leadership, and so I've seen some leaders that are really digging into this work, and I think what's important is that leaders continue to come together and have the conversation about their practice and what's working, and what they need to consider and do differently, and think about their collective impact as well in relation to the work that they do. So just ensuring that leaders continue to have those conversations, I think, is something else important.
I really appreciate you, Jenni, taking time out this afternoon and adding to this conversation on leadership, specifically collective efficacy.
Thank you for having me as a guest today. I really enjoyed it.